Welcome back to Scottish Sleep Stories. In tonight's episode, we journey into the quiet before the storm, into the silence that fell over Westeros just before everything changed, before the war, before the fall of a dynasty, before the Iron Throne passed from dragon to stag. Tonight, we'll explore the true story of Robert's rebellion, the madness of a king, the prophecy-haunted prince, the crown of winter roses that sparked a kingdom's ruin, and the choices that reshaped history forever. But here is the question I want you to consider as we begin. Do you believe this war was born from love or from destiny? Was it rebellion against tyranny or the unfolding of something long foretold? If you enjoy deep, immersive storytelling that brings history and legend to life, don't forget to subscribe to Scottish Sleep Stories. And as you listen, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe truly caused the fall of the Targaryens? Now, there exists a certain hush, a pregnant stillness that descends upon a kingdom in the moments preceding monumental change. It is not the comforting silence of peace, the crackling tranquility of a hearth fire on a winter's eve, or the gentle hush of falling snow blanketing the landscape. This silence is distinct, imbued with a palpable tension. It is the collective held breath of a realm, a silent anticipation as it senses without yet fully comprehending that the very foundations of the world it has always known are about to shatter. Westeros was no stranger to this foreboding silence in the years leading up to Robert's rebellion. Lords continued to host lavish feasts in their grand halls, the sounds of merriment echoing through the night. Ravens diligently carried missives between towering castles, their wings cutting through the air. Knights clad in gleaming armor rode out on hunts, their hounds baying in pursuit of game. And the small folk, the backbone of the realm, toiled in their fields, coaxing sustenance from the earth. Superficially, life in Westeros continued as it always had, a familiar tapestry woven with threads of tradition and routine. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the proud banners and the centuries-old oaths sworn to the Targaryen dynasty, a subtle unraveling had begun. The reign of Aerys II, the Mad King, had been rotting from within for years, slowly and insidiously, like damp creeping through the stonework of a mighty fortress, weakening its structure until the very walls threatened to crumble. Those closest to the king, the members of his court, his advisors, his own family, were the first to witness this decay. The man who sat upon the Iron Throne, the symbol of Targaryen power, was no longer the promising ruler he had once been. A shadow had fallen upon him, twisting his mind and poisoning his judgment. What followed, the rebellion that ultimately brought an end to nearly 3 centuries of Targaryen rule, did not erupt from the clash of armies on the battlefield. It began with a seemingly innocent gesture, the placement of winter roses in a young girl's lap. A brother's simmering rage, a father's agonizing death, and a king's unchecked madness unleashed a chain of events that would engulf the realm in fire and blood. It ended in rivers of blood staining the soil of Westeros crimson. This is the story of Robert's rebellion, a tale of love and loss, of betrayal and sacrifice, of madness and courage. Gather close to the fire, let its warmth seep into your bones, for the tale I am about to unfold is far from warm. It is a chilling reminder of the fragility of power and the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition. Aerys Targaryen, in his youth, was not the tyrannical figure that history remembers with such disdain. There was a time, a brief but shining moment, that those who lived through it still recall with a mixture of mournful wonder and disbelief, when he was considered one of the most promising kings the Targaryen dynasty had produced in generations. Ambitious and possessed of a quick and restless intelligence, he ascended to the Iron Throne with the unwavering confidence of a man who truly believed himself capable of achieving greatness. And for a time, the realm, weary of the stagnation of previous reigns, dared to believe in him too. Those early years, Aerys spoke of grand plans for the future of Westeros, new roads to connect the disparate regions, bustling harbors to facilitate trade, and a renewed effort to establish lucrative trade routes with the distant shores of the East. He made a point of visiting his lords in their ancestral seats, traveling throughout the realm with an infectious energy that suggested a man determined to leave an indelible mark on the history of Westeros. The small folk, fortunate enough to glimpse their young king as he processed through their humble villages, saw a figure of hope. A young king in gleaming armor, his eyes bright with vision, his silver Targaryen hair catching the sunlight like spun moonlight. They whispered amongst themselves, daring to hope that perhaps this generation would be different, that the troubled reigns of the past would finally give way to an era of peace and prosperity. And beside him in those hopeful early years stood a hand who balanced him perfectly, a man whose strengths complemented Aerys's weaknesses, Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, a man of cold, precise competence whose mind functioned with the ruthless efficiency of a ledger, every debt meticulously recorded, every asset carefully measured, every liability ruthlessly calculated and contained. Where Aerys was mercurial, prone to sudden bursts of enthusiasm and impulsive decisions, Tywin was steady, a rock of pragmatism in a turbulent sea. Where the king leaned toward the dramatic and the impulsive, his hand leaned toward the methodical and the calculated. Together, for a time, they seemed like the kind of partnership that could sustain a long and prosperous peace, a harmonious blend of vision and practicality. Tywin efficiently managed the daily affairs of the realm, meticulously overseeing the grain tallies, the tax rolls, and the long-standing disputes between lesser lords, ensuring that the crown ran smoothly enough that few lords found reason to voice their complaints too loudly. The credit for that smoothness, at least publicly, was given to the King Aerys. But the lords who dealt directly with the crown, who witnessed Tywin's unwavering competence firsthand, knew where the true power resided, where the real decisions were being made, and that knowledge, that subtle shift in perception, was the seed of everything that would eventually go wrong between them. Relationships between kings and their advisors, particularly their hands, are fragile things, delicate ecosystems that require constant tending. They depend on mutual trust, on egos kept firmly in check, on the king being willing to be served by someone more capable than himself without succumbing to resentment and envy. And Aerys, as the years passed and his mind grew increasingly suspicious, more volatile, more easily stoked to fury, found himself increasingly unable to maintain that equanimity. He began to see in Tywin not a loyal servant of the crown, but a potential rival to it, a shadow looming over his throne. He began to feel fueled by whispers and paranoia that the realm loved his hand more than it loved its king. Lords praised Tywin's efficient administration. Merchants valued the unwavering reliability of House Lannister. There were whispers, carefully not made directly to Aerys's ear lest the speaker face the king's wrath, that the real power at court wore a golden lion, the sigil of House Lannister, and not a three-headed dragon, the sigil of House Targaryen. Aerys, who had always imagined himself at the very center of the historical tapestry, found himself slowly receding toward the margins of his own reign, his influence diminishing with each passing year. The paranoia grew from that seed, quietly at first, manifesting in small ways that those closest to him initially noted and excused, telling themselves that these were temporary aberrations, that they would pass with time. A king's temper, after all, was not unusual. Every reign had its storms, its moments of turbulence. The men and women around Aerys had enough experience with the intricacies of courtly life to know that proximity to power required patience and understanding. But the paranoia did not pass. It festered, growing stronger with each perceived slight, each imagined insult. It is the particular cruelty of minds that turn inward in such a destructive manner that they do not crumble all at once, collapsing in a single dramatic event. Instead, they decay slowly and agonizingly like a rotting corpse. They find suspicion where there is none, seeking evidence of conspiracy in ordinary gestures, interpreting treachery in expressions of loyalty, and perceiving mockery in acts of deference. Chris began to see plots everywhere lurking in the faces of his counselors, hidden within the contents of letters that passed through the castle, even in the very question of succession itself. He grew possessive of his power in the way a desperate man clutches something he fears will be stolen, until the very act of clutching becomes the cause of the object's damage. His relationship with Tywin curdled over years of accumulated insults, some imagined, born from his paranoia, others inflicted deliberately, fueled by his growing resentment. When Tywin's son Jaime, a young man of extraordinary promise, was chosen for the King's Guard, the elite order of knights sworn to protect the monarch, it was widely understood as Aerys's calculated gesture of contempt, a deliberate attempt to wound Tywin. A man of the King's Guard could not marry, could not inherit, and could not become Lord of Casterly Rock. By taking Jaime into his White Cloak service, Aerys had effectively stripped Tywin of his heir and his legacy, ensuring that the Lannister line would end with Tywin himself. The king had found a cruelty that required no blade, a weapon more subtle and devastating than any sword. In response, Tywin resigned his position as Hand of the King, throwing the realm into further disarray. He returned to Casterly Rock, his ancestral seat in the Westerlands, his pride wounded, his ambition thwarted. He did not make a public grievance of it, but he also did not forget the insult. The slight festered within him, fueling his resentment and shaping his future actions. And in the years that followed, as the court filled with lesser men, sycophants, and flatterers who knew how to tell a king what he wished to hear rather than what he needed to know, the rot within Aerys festered unchecked, finding less and less resistance. The voices of reason and restraint were silenced, replaced by the echoes of madness. There were moments, pivotal events that sharpened the decay into something far more dangerous, moments that marked the point of no return in Aerys's unraveling. The Defiance of Duskendale is one such event, a turning point that historians return to again and again because it so clearly demonstrates the depths of Aerys's descent into madness. Lord Dennis Darklyn of Duskendale, a port city in the Crownlands, had grown resentful of the king's policies, feeling that his city was being unfairly burdened by royal taxation and regulations. In a decision that still baffles those who attempt to understand it, a catastrophic miscalculation born of pride and desperation, he chose to hold the king himself hostage. His reasoning, as muddled as it was, centered on issues of city charters and trading rights, a localized dispute blown out of all proportion. Aerys, with his small traveling retinue, rode to Duskendale personally, intending to address the grievance and assert his royal authority. Instead, he found himself seized, betrayed by a lord he had trusted, and thrown into the dungeons of the Dunfort, Duskendale's imposing castle. He was held there for nearly half a year, a prisoner in his own kingdom. At court in King's Landing, men moved cautiously in that time, each step carefully considered, each word carefully chosen. No one wanted to commit an army to retake Duskendale, fearing that any direct action might result in the king's death before he could be rescued. The situation was a delicate dance on the edge of a knife. It fell to Sir Barristan Selmy, a knight already renowned for his unmatched skill with a sword and his unwavering courage, to resolve the crisis. He was already developing the reputation that would eventually make him one of the most celebrated knights of his generation, a true embodiment of chivalry. Under the cover of darkness, Barristan Selmy slipped into the city with a small company of hand-picked soldiers, navigating the treacherous streets and evading the watchful eyes of the Duskendale guards. He infiltrated the Dunfort, fought his way through the labyrinthine corridors, and finally reached the dungeon where the king was being held. He freed Aerys from his captivity, and together they fought their way back to safety, escaping Duskendale and returning to King's Landing. Lord Darklyn's audacious plan ended with his house extinguished, wiped from the face of Westeros. Every member of the Darklyn line, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent, was put to the sword. The neighboring house that had foolishly supported him in his act of rebellion met the same grim fate. Aerys made certain that the lesson was absolute, a brutal display of royal power designed to deter any future acts of defiance. But when Aerys emerged from those dungeons, the man who came out was not the man who had entered. The captivity had broken something within him, leaving him scarred and twisted. The particular quality of what broke is difficult to define, but it was a fundamental shift in his perception of the world and his place in it. The indignity of being held captive, the helplessness of his situation, the image of himself, a Targaryen, blood of the dragon, sitting in the dark at the mercy of a minor lord, all of it combined to shatter his sense of self. A king should command respect, inspire fear. A Targaryen should be inviolate, a symbol of power and authority. He should never suffer fear. That knowledge, that stark realization of his own vulnerability, sat inside him afterward like a festering wound that would not close cleanly, poisoning his mind and driving him further into madness. Men who are held captive and then released sometimes find their way back to themselves, gradually piecing together the shattered fragments of their former lives. They reach for the familiar rhythms of their previous existence, and gradually the trauma recedes enough to be managed, to be integrated into their understanding of the world. Aerys, however, did not find his way back. He reached instead for the thing that had always felt most like power, the thing he associated most deeply with the ancient legacy of his house, fire. His obsession with wildfire, that volatile and destructive substance, deepened in the years that followed the Defiance of Duskendale, consuming his thoughts and shaping his actions. The pyromancers, the members of the Alchemist's Guild, the keepers of that terrible green substance that burned hotter than ordinary flame and could not be extinguished by water, found themselves elevated to a prominence they had not previously enjoyed at court. They were consulted on matters of state, their opinions valued above those of seasoned advisors. They were indulged in their esoteric experiments, granted access to vast resources. Their methods were questioned in obsessive detail, the intricacies of their craft dissected and analyzed. Aerys filled their ears with grand visions of fiery destruction, of cleansing flames that would purify the realm. He filled the city's hidden places with their clay pots of liquid fire, a silent army waiting to be unleashed. He saw in wildfire the power to restore the Targaryen dynasty to its former glory, the power to silence his enemies and crush any dissent. He saw in it the resonance of old stories, of dragons soaring through the sky, of conquest and dominion, of the bloodright of his house. He knew at some level that he would never have a dragon of his own. The last of the great beasts had died generations before his birth, their roars silenced, their scales turned to dust, and the magic that had called them into being, the ancient blood rituals and arcane incantations, could not simply be commanded back, but fire, even the fire of men, even the constructed and bottled approximation that the pyromancers brewed in their vaulted chambers, felt like the closest thing available, a pale imitation of the power that had once flowed through the veins of his ancestors. And fire, unlike his rebellious lords and his scheming advisors, was something he could control. Unlike his son Rhaegar, who inspired devotion and loyalty in those around him, Aerys could not command genuine affection. Unlike his former hand Tywin, who had outshone him in matters of governance, Aerys could not inspire competence. But fire, the destructive force that consumed all in its path, did what it was told. It obeyed his commands, bending to his will, his cruelty sharpened alongside his obsession, becoming a defining characteristic of his reign. Men who crossed him in council, who dared to voice dissenting opinions, might find themselves languishing in a cell, stripped of their titles and possessions. Men in cells, those who had fallen out of favor or incurred the king's wrath, might find themselves dragged into the courtyard, bound to a post, with the pyromancers standing ready, their faces masked, their hands clutching the tools of their terrifying trade. Those who witnessed such scenes reported a particular brightness in the king's eye during these moments, a relaxing of the jaw that almost passed for relief, as if the act of inflicting pain somehow eased the torment within him. Those around him adapted, as people always adapt to the unpredictable weather of a powerful man's moods. They learned what not to say, what topics to avoid, what expressions to suppress. They learned to agree, to smooth over disagreements, and to redirect the conversation away from dangerous subjects, because the alternative was to become the example, to suffer the king's wrath firsthand. The small council, the men who were supposed to advise and moderate and serve as the thoughtful mechanism of governance, became instead a collection of survivors, each calculating daily how to remain standing while the ground shifted beneath their feet. The trust and candor that had once characterized their deliberations were replaced by fear and suspicion. Aerys distrusted Rhaegar, his own son and heir, the prince who had grown up reading in libraries and playing his silver harp, and who inspired the kind of easy affection in lords and small folk that Aerys had spent years chasing without finding. Aerys saw in Rhaegar's popularity not a valuable resource for the crown, but a direct threat to his throne, a potential rival waiting to usurp his power. He could not be certain, for paranoia never provided certainty, only the persistent low hum of suspicion, but he wondered whether his son was simply admired for his grace and intelligence, or whether he was actively preparing to supplant him. And so, by the time the great tournament at Harrenhal was announced, the stage was already set for disaster. The king's court was a place of fear, a stage where elaborate ceremonies masked the underlying currents of paranoia and resentment. His counsel served him not out of loyalty or respect, but out of a desperate desire for survival. The small mercies, the acts of compassion and restraint that had once prevented the worst excesses of his madness, had been worn away one by one, like stone under the relentless pressure of slow-moving water. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about the condition of Westeros in the years leading up to Robert's rebellion is not that Aerys was hated, though by then he was broadly feared rather than loved, and fear can maintain a certain kind of order. More dangerous was the fact that the old checks on a king's worst impulses, the safeguards that had traditionally prevented a monarch from descending into tyranny, had been almost entirely dismantled. The trusted hand, the honest counsel, the family member who could speak plainly and offer dissenting advice, all of it had been stripped away or cowed into silence. There was no one left who could pull on his sleeve and say, "Enough. There is no good end down this path." When a wheel begins to turn in such conditions, without brakes or restraints, there is nothing to slow its momentum. Westeros was not yet at war, but it was poised on the brink, ready to erupt into chaos at the slightest spark. Was the purse from the it was a pat the small they cheered. There was a weather that by Harrenhal it was the first Rhaegar he was Rhaegar he moved and then he rode the crown of flowers. The traditional symbol of victory and honor at the end of a great tournament was traditionally placed upon her brow, acknowledging her role as the queen of love and beauty. That was the custom, the expectation, the ritual that years of such events had trained the watching lords and ladies to anticipate. Instead, Rhaegar continued riding, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the princess. He stopped before Lyanna Stark. She was the daughter of Rickard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, a young woman still in her mid-teens, dark-haired and gray-eyed in the manner of the old northern blood, with a reputation carefully noted by her father and brother for being fiercer and more independent than her station required. She was also betrothed to Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, in an arrangement that had been carefully negotiated to bind the two houses together, forging a strong alliance between the Stormlands and the North. And Rhaegar Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone, heir to the Iron Throne, placed the crown of winter roses not on his wife, but in Lyanna Stark's lap, naming her the Queen of Love and Beauty, publicly rejecting his wife and bestowing the honor upon another man's betrothed. The silence that followed lasted a breath too long, an eternity in the tense atmosphere of the tournament. It was a silence pregnant with unspoken words, with shocked disbelief, with simmering resentment, with the weight of centuries of tradition being carelessly cast aside. There are accounts from men who were present that describe the crowd's reaction differently, depending on where they stood and who they were loyal to. Those who loved pageantry and spectacle saw a moment of breathtaking drama, a romantic gesture that transcended the mundane realities of politics. Those who loved Elia or felt loyalty to the Dornish princess experienced the moment as a deeply personal and public humiliation, the kind that leaves lasting marks on a person's dignity that do not heal cleanly. Those who had spent years reading the signs of the realm's instability, who had watched Aerys burn, who had watched Rhaegar disappear into his studies and his silences, who had counted the small decisions that had accumulated into a growing sense of danger, felt a chill move through the air, a premonition of the chaos to come. Robert Baratheon was present, his face darkening with fury. He watched Rhaegar crown another man's betrothed, his own betrothed, and he said nothing in the moment, knowing that a violent response in such a setting was impossible, that it would only bring dishonor upon himself and his house. But his feelings about the gesture were never truly hidden. He was not a man of subtle reaction, prone to explosive outbursts and passionate displays of emotion. Whatever form his response took in the weeks and months that followed, the drinking, the arguments, the particular loudness of his company at feasts, it drew from a wellspring of anger and resentment that had been filled to overflowing at Harrenhal. Now, Rhaegar's intentions at that tournament have been debated and analyzed ever since, dissected by historians and gossiped about by courtiers. The simplest reading is that it was the vanity of a prince who had fallen into feeling for a girl he had seen and who acted on that feeling without regard for the consequences, a reckless act of passion that ignited a kingdom. But those who knew Rhaegar's character, those who had observed him closely over the years, pushed back on the simplicity of that reading. He was not a man who acted on impulse, not a frivolous prince driven by fleeting desires. He was a man who acted on conviction, on deeply held beliefs, and who believed that his convictions had roots in something older and larger than the immediate moment, something that transcended personal desires and ambitions. Whatever prophecy or pattern he saw in Lyanna Stark, whatever role he had assigned her in the great story he believed himself to be living, It was not by the evidence of his behavior before and after, an ordinary desire, a simple infatuation. That does not make what followed right, nor does it excuse the pain and suffering he caused. It may, however, make it stranger, more complex, more difficult to understand. In the months after Harrenhal, Rhaegar was absent from court more frequently and with less explanation, his actions shrouded in secrecy. He was consulting with scholars, delving deeper into ancient texts. He was riding south, disappearing for weeks at a time. He was, by the fragmentary accounts of those who glimpsed him in that period, a man pursuing something with great urgency and great certainty, a man driven by a purpose that consumed him entirely. People who have that quality about them, that unwavering conviction, are not easily stopped by the ordinary considerations of other people's peace, their lives bent to the service of a higher calling. And then, one fateful day, Lyanna Stark disappeared, vanishing from Winterfell without a trace. The exact circumstances of that disappearance remain one of the great uncertainties of recent history, shrouded in rumor and speculation. There are those who say the prince rode north with armed companions, members of his household guard, and took her by force, a kidnapping as it was immediately understood throughout the realm, a blatant act of aggression that violated the laws of hospitality and dishonored House Stark. There are others, fewer in number, speaking more quietly, citing details that only emerged much later, who suggest that the reality was more complicated, that there were letters sent beforehand, secret communications between Rhaegar and Lyanna, that there were choices made that complicated the simple story of abduction, that Lyanna herself, fierce and unconventional, may have been less passive in the sequence of events than her age and her gender made it convenient to assume. But the truth of Lyanna's intentions, whatever they may have been, was not what moved the realm to war. What moved the realm was the assumption, the immediate and reasonable conclusion drawn by the vast majority of people, given what had been seen at Harrenhal, consistent with everything a highborn girl's disappearance with a prince's household guard suggested, abduction, the dishonoring of a Stark daughter by a Targaryen prince who had already insulted her betrothed before thousands of witnesses. For Robert Baratheon, Lyanna's disappearance was everything he had feared since Harrenhal made manifest, the culmination of his worst nightmares. Lord Rickard Stark, it was a crisis that required a careful, measured response, the kind a senior lord with experience in these matters would be expected to provide: deliberation, counsel, a raven sent to allies, a plan assembled before any rash action was taken. But the first Stark to act was not Rickard, the wise and cautious lord of Winterfell. It was his headstrong and impulsive son, Brandon. Before the war, before the crown of roses, before Lyanna's name became a word spoken in the same breath as ruin, there was a boy reading in a library, a prince who had turned somewhere in his youth from the ordinary training of lordship toward the study of older things, a scholar delving into the mysteries of the past. He had, by the accounts of the maesters who served Dragonstone, spent long stretches of his boyhood in the castle's vast and dusty library, poring over ancient tomes and forgotten scrolls. He read histories and prophecies and the records of ancient Targaryen dreams, searching for answers to questions that few others even dared to ask. And at some point in that reading, the exact age varies depending on the telling, he found something that changed the direction of everything, something that set him on a path that would lead him to both glory and ruin. He set down his books, closed the leather-bound volumes, and asked for a sword, abandoning the world of scholarship for the life of a warrior. The men around him at the time took it as a natural transition, a prince growing into his martial responsibilities, preparing himself to rule. But those who paid closer attention to what Rhaegar said in those years, those who listened carefully to his cryptic pronouncements and his veiled allusions, believed that the change was not about ambition or custom. It was about duty, a sense of obligation to something larger than himself. He had read enough to conclude that a warrior would be needed for what was coming, for the great darkness that he believed was looming on the horizon, and that the warrior would have to be him. The tradition he was reading in was old, ancient prophecies about a promised prince, a hero reborn from the line of the dragon, destined to stand against a great darkness, the legend of Azor Ahai, the Song of Ice and Fire, as some texts named it. These were not idle stories to Rhaegar, not mere myths and legends. They were, as he came to understand them, a map, a guide to the future, a map of what the world required, the role he was destined to play, and who was meant to provide it. He believed for much of his youth that the prince in the prophecy was himself, that he was the chosen one destined to save the world. This conviction was not madness, not in the same way that his father's obsessions were madness. Aerys's madness was born of fear and paranoia, of cruelty and a desperate need for control. Rhaegar's conviction was different, ordered, studied, the product of years of careful reading and sincere belief, not of malice or delusion. He was a man who had constructed, through genuine intellectual effort, a framework for understanding his own life and his place in the age he lived in, a grand narrative that gave meaning to his existence. The difficulty is that conviction, however carefully built, does not make a man right, makes him certain, unwavering in his beliefs, impervious to doubt, and certainty, particularly the kind that concerns one's own destiny, has a way of bending other people's lives around itself without asking their permission, twisting their fates to fit the contours of a preordained narrative. People who interacted with Rhaegar often noted a peculiar duality in his character, a blend of genuine warmth and an underlying detachment. He possessed a captivating presence, demonstrating a sincere curiosity towards those he engaged with, lavishing them with his undivided attention. Yet lurking behind his captivating eyes was the unmistakable impression of a man preoccupied, his thoughts consumed by matters that demanded his presence at a specific location and time, for reasons he could not fully articulate to those around him. It was as if a vital part of him remained elsewhere, tethered to some distant imperative. As the years unfolded and the weight of prophecy gradually dominated his thoughts, Rhaegar became increasingly fixated on deciphering the markers described within the ancient texts. "The dragon must have 3 heads," he would murmur, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The hero will be born of a specific lineage, under specific signs." His relentless pursuit led him to delve into the intricate web of bloodlines, meticulously scrutinizing his own children, Rhaenys and young Aegon, born to Elia Martell. Through a process of interpretation that remained shrouded in the mists of incomplete records, he came to believe in the imperative need for a 3rd child. Leah's health had suffered considerably during her previous pregnancies, and the royal maesters had cautioned against the grave risks associated with another birth. Rhaegar was fully aware of these dangers, yet he weighed this knowledge against the perceived demands of the prophecy, a prophecy that had become the cornerstone of his understanding of the world and his place within it. Was a terrible choice, one that history would grapple with for generations to come. The question of whether that fateful decision was cemented at Harrenhal during that legendary tourney continues to fuel endless debate. Was the crown of winter roses presented to Lyanna Stark merely an expression of personal affection, or did it signify a deeper prophetic intent? It is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively resolve, leaving room for endless speculation and interpretation. Those who held Rhaegar in high esteem championed the nobler interpretation, emphasizing the sincerity of his beliefs and the weight of the perceived burden he carried. However, those who bear witness to the devastating consequences of his actions argue that the nobility of motive does not lessen the impact of the ensuing events. A kingdom, after all, cares little for the intentions behind an action when that action plunges it into the chaos of war. Rhaegar's elopement with Lyanna Stark, whatever the circumstances surrounding it, was an act fueled by a certainty about the future, a certainty forged over years of solitary study and fervent conviction. He was not inherently cruel, nor was he careless in the conventional sense. Rather, he was a man who had reached a quiet, deliberate conclusion over the course of his life, that he understood the profound demands that destiny placed upon him. Perhaps he was right about the impending darkness, about the chilling threat that lurked beyond the wall, an ancient evil dismissed by the rest of the realm as mere children's tales. Time would ultimately render its verdict on that question. However, even being correct about the looming danger did not justify the methods employed in preparing for it. The realm does not readily forgive the torching of its houses, regardless of whether the torchbearer genuinely believed he was constructing a beacon of hope. Brandon Stark was a mere 20 years of age, the heir to Winterfell and all that the North represented. By all accounts, he embodied the ideals expected of a lord-in-waiting. He was imposing in stature, courageous, quick to anger, and even quicker to action. He possessed his father's regal bearing and echoed the ancient kings of winter in the way he carried himself. He was, crucially for the events that followed, a young man of intense emotion, fiercely devoted to his sister, and utterly lacking in patience when he perceived that her love had been dishonored. When news reached him that Lyanna had vanished, spirited away to the south by Rhaegar Targaryen, Brandon did not hesitate. He bypassed the customary protocols. He did not ride north to consult with his father, Lord Rickard. He did not dispatch a raven to Jon Arryn for counsel, nor did he seek the advice of his betrothed's father, Lord Hoster Tully. Fueled by a burning sense of outrage, he gathered a small group of companions and rode directly for King's Landing, his heart a tempest of fury. He arrived at the formidable gates of the Red Keep and issued a defiant challenge, his voice ringing with youthful anger. He demanded that Prince Rhaegar emerge and answer for his transgression. "Come out and die," were the unforgettable words that witnesses recalled. In a different court, under the reign of a more temperate king, Brandon's impassioned outburst might have been handled with greater finesse. A more level-headed ruler might have received him with patience, listened to his grievances, and offered some form of resolution that preserved appearances while allowing time for the truth, whatever it may be, to surface. Indeed, there were men within the court who possessed the diplomatic skill to navigate such a delicate situation. However, the man who received the news of Brandon's reckless challenge was Aerys Targaryen, the Mad King. Aerys did not see a distraught brother seeking justice. Instead, he perceived treason. He saw a northern lord audaciously challenging the blood of the crown within the very heart of royal power. Brandon's defiant act, Aerys saw the manifestation of all the conspiracies that had haunted his increasingly paranoid mind for years. He immediately ordered Brandon and his companions to be seized and brought before him in chains. This was the first catastrophe, the spark that would ignite a realm. The second came soon after, when Lord Rickard Stark received word of his son's imprisonment. He had no alternative but to travel to King's Landing, to appear before the king himself, and to seek, through the established channels of law and custom, the release of his heir. Lords summoned to court had the inherent right to travel safely under the king's protection. These were not merely traditions. They formed the bedrock of the compact that held the realm together. Rickard journeyed south in good faith, trusting in the age-old rules that govern such matters. But Aerys had already predetermined Rickard's fate. The trial that followed was a grotesque mockery of justice. Aerys declared that the Starks would face trial by combat, a tradition steeped in history. Typically, a champion would be selected, blades would be drawn, and the gods were expected to reveal their judgment through the outcome of the duel. However, Aerys named fire as his champion, not a knight, not a sword, but the element itself. What transpired within the throne room that day was not justice, nor even pure, unadulterated madness. It was the act of a king who had abandoned all pretense. Lord Rickard Stark, Warden of the North, lord of an ancient house that had ruled the North for 8,000 years, was suspended from the rafters in his full armor while a fire was lit beneath him. He was burned alive, a horrific spectacle of royal cruelty. Brandon was forced to bear witness to his father's agonizing demise. A noose had been fastened around his neck, and a sword was placed just beyond his desperate reach. With each futile attempt to grasp the blade, the noose tightened relentlessly. Brandon died strangled, agonizingly close to a means of escape that was forever out of reach. Cruel kings had occupied the Iron Throne before. Maegor the Cruel had committed unspeakable atrocities. Others had succumbed to moments of terrible excess. But these cruelties were often directed at those who had genuinely transgressed some established boundary or at enemies already stripped of the law's protection. What Aerys did to the Starks, however, shattered a fundamental principle. Lords who arrived at court under the king's protection in response to a lawful summons were supposed to be safe from harm. This was not merely a long-standing tradition, it was the very foundation of every feudal relationship within the realm. If a king could summarily execute great lords who came to court in good faith, then no lord was safe. The entire intricate arrangement of loyalty and service became utterly meaningless. The message reverberating throughout the realm was far different from what Aerys intended to convey. He believed he was demonstrating his absolute power, but in reality he was demonstrating that his power had turned against the very structures that legitimized it. Aerys then dispatched demands to Jon Arryn, Lord of the Eyrie. He demanded the heads of Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, Ned, the last surviving Stark son, and Robert, whose betrothed had been stolen. Jon Arryn had raised both boys as his wards, nurturing them as if they were his own sons. Now the king he faithfully served was demanding their murders. Jon Arryn was well into his 60s, having served the Iron Throne with unwavering loyalty throughout his long life, observing the Targaryen dynasty with the patient dedication of a man who believed in the continuity of things. However, there are limits to what loyalty can demand, and the demand to kill two young men he had raised and loved, merely to appease the paranoia of a king who had just burned a great lord alive, far exceeded those limits. And so Jon Arryn called his banners and went to war. The rebellion that followed was not a clean, unified movement. Such things rarely are. Jon Arryn's decision did not trigger an immediate, coordinated uprising. Rather, it unleashed a series of individual decisions made by lords who had been waiting, some consciously, others subconsciously, for the signal to act. The executions of Rickard and Brandon Stark had not merely outraged the North. They had confirmed for every lord in the realm who had observed Aerys's descent with growing unease that the situation had deteriorated beyond the point of redemption. There exists a pivotal moment in the decline of any great order when its adherents transition from hoping for improvement to preparing for the inevitable aftermath. Aerys had provided that moment. The men who stepped forward to oppose him were not revolutionaries, at least not in their own eyes. Most of them, Robert's grief and fury were inextricably intertwined, transforming him into an elemental force in the coming conflict. Men followed Eddard's. The North did not enter wars lightly, but when it did, it fought with the unwavering seriousness of a people who understood that the vast distances and harsh winters of their homeland rendered every campaign a high-stakes gamble. They could not afford to squander their numbers. They fought carefully and completely. Hoster Tully of Riverrun threw his lot in with the rebels as well, securing the allegiance of the Riverlands and, crucially, control of the continent's strategically vital center. His decision was not solely driven by sympathy for the Stark cause. It was also a matter of astute political calculation. Hoster solidified the newly formed alliance through strategic marriages. Eddard Stark, who had been betrothed to a daughter of Riverrun in an arrangement disrupted by Brandon's death, now married Catelyn Tully. Jon Arryn married Lysa Tully. The rebellion was forged as much through blood bonds as through shared grievances. What the rebellion lacked, however, was Dorne. Prince Rhaegar's wife was Elia Martell. The Dornish had ample reason for grievance. The insult of Harrenhal, the humiliation of witnessing the crown prince publicly set aside his wife, was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet the Martells did not join the rebellion. They waited and watched, their motives unclear. Whether driven by shrewd calculation or genuine loyalty to Elia and her children's rightful place in the Targaryen line, Dorne remained neutral. This neutrality would not shield them from the war's consequences. However, it meant that the rebel alliance, despite its considerable strength, lacked the support of the entire realm. The Tyrells of the Reach remained steadfastly loyal to the crown. House Tyrell commanded vast resources and a formidable army, and their decision to support Aerys, or more accurately, their refusal to abandon him, prevented the rebel forces from sweeping through the south unopposed. The Siege of Storm's End, where Stannis Baratheon defended Robert's ancestral seat against a Tyrell army, would endure for the duration of the war without ever yielding. And then there was Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, the man who, for years, had served as the most capable hand the realm had ever seen. He declared for neither side. He amassed his armies at Casterly Rock and waited, observing. He communicated with both sides, offering no commitment to either. The realm understood in the unspoken language of lords that Tywin's support would ultimately go to whichever side appeared most likely to emerge victorious. He had not forgiven Aerys for the insults he had endured in recent years, the dismissals, the deliberate humiliations, the king's calculated efforts to diminish him. However, Tywin was not a man who acted on sentiment. He acted on cold, hard calculation. Until the outcome of the conflict became definitively clear, he kept his sword sheathed. This, then, was the strategic landscape as the war commenced. A rebel alliance comprised of the North, the Vale, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands against the Crown, which held the Westerlands in a state of wary neutrality and commanded the armed forces of the Reach. The Crownlands, the territories immediately surrounding King's Landing, and the royal armies lay between them, the epicenter of the impending storm. The early battles favored the rebels. Robert Baratheon proved himself a natural commander, exhibiting immediate and decisive prowess on the battlefield. He was not a subtle tactician. He did not engage in complex maneuvers or deceptive strategies. He attacked, leading from the front with a ferocity that inspired his men and terrified his enemies. The warhammer he wielded, a weapon perfectly suited to a man of his build and temperament, a weapon too cumbersome for most knights to wield effectively, a weapon capable of crushing armor with a force that no blade could match, became a symbol of the rebellion before the war was even half over. There were setbacks, as there always are. The rebel forces were not always perfectly coordinated. Communication across the vast distances of Westeros was slow and unreliable. The Loyalist armies were not without skill or courage. The war's initial phase was a grueling, exhausting affair, less a clean clash of champions, as songs would later romanticize it, and more a difficult grinding effort to keep armies fed, allied lords appeased, and supply lines intact across hundreds of miles of contested territory. However, momentum was gradually shifting in favor of the rebels, building towards a single decisive moment. There exists a unique form of power held by the man who remains motionless, while the armies of the realm clashed in bloody conflict, while ravens crisscrossed the skies carrying messages of war and alliance, while the flames of rebellion spread across the Riverlands and the Stormlands. Tywin Lannister sat at Casterly Rock, his host assembled, his banners furled. He was, by most measures, the most powerful lord in Westeros. His wealth was legendary. His armies were among the largest and best equipped that a single house could field. His experience in governance, his deep understanding of what it actually took to hold a kingdom together, surpassed that of nearly every man alive. And yet he declared for neither side. To understand why he remained aloof and the true significance of his waiting, one must understand the complex character of Tywin Lannister and the history of his relationship with Aerys Targaryen. The two men had shaped each other in ways that did not flatter either of them. Tywin had served as Hand of the King for the better part of 2 decades. He had stabilized the realm during Aerys's early years of erratic behavior, filling the vacuum created by the king's inconsistent governance, and keeping the daily operations of the crown functioning through the sheer force of his own competence. During those years, Tywin had come to believe that he was indispensable, that his service had elevated him to a position akin to a partner in the exercise of power. Aerys, however, held a vastly different view. His decision to induct Jaime into the Kingsguard was the most unambiguous statement of his perception of Tywin's ambitions. It was not done for Jaime's benefit, nor for the benefit of the Kingsguard itself. It was done to inflict a wound on Tywin in the most vulnerable place for a lord of his nature, his legacy, his heir, the continuation of everything he had painstakingly built. By taking Jaime, Aerys had communicated in the language of power rather than words. You serve at my pleasure, and I can take from you whatever I choose. Tywin had resigned from his position as Hand and retreated to Casterly Rock, but he had not forgotten. He was not a man who easily forgot slights, real or perceived. Now the realm was engulfed in war, and both sides sought his allegiance. Aerys dispatched ravens, pleading with Tywin to honor their long-standing association. Robert's representatives extended overtures, promising rewards and influence. Both sides understood that the arrival of the Lannister host on their side of the conflict could decisively alter the balance of power. Tywin received them all, listening intently to their pleas and promises. However, he revealed nothing. He kept his intentions secret, his army at the ready, and his face an impenetrable mask. Lords who attempted to glean his position from his responses encountered only the carefully cultivated surface of a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that his countenance revealed nothing he had not chosen to reveal. Tywin's waiting was not born of indifference. It was an exercise in precision. He understood with a cold clarity that distinguished him from most men in positions of power that the value of his intervention depended entirely on its timing. To act prematurely would merely assist one side in winning the war, and his support would be taken for granted rather than appropriately rewarded. The Lannisters would fight and bleed, and the victor would thank them politely before promptly forgetting their sacrifices. However, to wait for the right moment, to have his army march through the gates of a collapsing capital would allow him to dictate the terms of the New World Order. The Battle of the Trident provided him with that opportunity. With Rhaegar dead and the Loyalist cause shattered, the inevitable outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was the manner in which King's Landing would fall and who would be seen as its conqueror. Aerys, perhaps genuinely believing that Tywin would honor their old bonds, perhaps driven by desperation, perhaps gripped by a mind that could no longer accurately assess the intentions of those around him, extended an invitation welcoming the Lannister army into the city. Tywin accepted. He marched his host to the gates of King's Landing, and he was granted entry because the men guarding those gates recognized the Lannister colors, remembered the Lannister history of service to the crown, and trusted in the Lannister promises, which had yet to reveal their true nature. And then the gates were open, and the lion was within the walls, and the calculation was complete. It is worthwhile to pause and consider Robert Baratheon himself, not the king he would later become, but the young man who fought in this war. He was approximately 20 years old when the rebellion erupted. He stood over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a commanding physical presence that would have been the envy of commanders twice his age. He had been trained at the Eyrie, raised alongside Eddard Stark under the watchful tutelage of Jon Arryn, schooled in the arts of war, governance, and the responsibilities of lordship. He was not uneducated, nor was he simple-minded. However, what truly distinguished him from the cautious, measured men around him, from Ned's quiet deliberation and Jon Arryn's long, patient wisdom, was the burning intensity of his emotions. Robert lived at the surface of himself. His joys were boundless, his rages were volcanic, and his grief, when it struck, possessed the power to reshape a man permanently. He had loved Lyanna Stark with the full force of his considerable capacity for feeling. That love had not yet been formally consummated. Their betrothal was a political arrangement, and their relationship had not yet progressed to marriage. Robert was not by nature a patient man in any aspect of his life. In the months leading up to the fateful tourney at Harrenhal, he had spent his time imagining a future with Lyanna, a future that Rhaegar had snatched away and replaced with something that felt to Robert like a profound theft and utter devastation. Lyanna's disappearance had not merely motivated him to fight, it had fused his personal devastation with his military purpose. He yearned to confront Rhaegar, to find the prince whose actions had set everything in motion, and to measure himself against him directly. Lords who might have calculated more carefully about the risks of rebellion found in Robert's uncomplicated fury a compelling reason to set aside their own reservations. He was a cause in himself, not a cautious lord weighing costs, but a man who had been wronged and who intended to right that wrong, inspiring other men to believe that their own grievances were legitimate enough to warrant action. On the battlefield, he was formidable in a way that even his harshest critics were forced to acknowledge. The warhammer he carried, a weapon perfectly suited to a man of his build and temperament, too heavy for most knights to wield effectively, capable of shattering armor in a way that the edge of a sword could not, became a recognizable symbol of the rebellion before the war was even half over. It was perfectly suited to him. He was not a man who required subtlety in his tools. By accounts that military strategists would later scrutinize, he fought multiple engagements in rapid succession at Summerhall. 3 separate loyalist forces had converged in that area, each capable of inflicting significant damage on rebel supply lines and communications. A more cautious commander might have consolidated his forces, chosen the strongest defensive ground, and waited for the loyalist armies to fully combine before attempting to counter them. Robert, however, chose a more audacious approach. He struck each force separately before they could link up, moving between engagements with a speed that his opponents did not anticipate, leveraging the shock of early victories to press his advantage before word of the defeats could spread. It was not an elegant strategy, nor would it have been recognized by the Academy of Careful Siegecraft as refined generalship. However, it proved remarkably effective because Robert understood a crucial element that the textbooks often overlooked. The spirit of an army matters just as much as its numbers, and striking swiftly and decisively before your enemy can recover from shock is often worth more than any tactical maneuver. His men believed in him implicitly. That is the crucial factor that the histories often gloss over too quickly. The grinding confusion of a civil war where supply wagons break down, messengers get lost, and the reasons for fighting sometimes become obscured in the mud and rain of a long campaign. Soldiers need something tangible to hold on to. Robert gave them himself. He was always present at the front lines. He did not command from a comfortable distance. When the hammer fell, it fell from his hand, and his men saw it, and they followed him without hesitation. Eddard Stark, marching south and west to join him, brought something different to the rebellion. Where Robert was fire, Ned was the unyielding weight behind the flame. The northern forces were smaller than those the southern kingdoms could field. The north's population had always been thinly spread across vast distances, and the armies that could be assembled from it reflected that reality. However, they moved with a singular purpose, exhibiting a grim determination that unnerved their enemies. They did not loot or burn unnecessarily, adhering to a strict code of conduct. They were disciplined enough not to overextend their supply lines or scatter in pursuit of individual glory. Ned, unlike many commanders, waged war with a methodical and humane approach, qualities rarely rewarded in the brutal theater of conflict. Yet these very traits were what held his forces together, providing a crucial cohesion that other armies lacked and often failed to maintain. Beneath Ned's calm and collected exterior, however, lay a profound weight, an invisible burden that he bore with grim determination. His father was dead, brutally executed by the Mad King. His brother Brandon also perished in the king's dungeons. His sister Lyanna, his dearest companion, was missing somewhere in the south, her circumstances shrouded in a cloud of unanswered and unsettling questions that gnawed at his peace of mind. He had unexpectedly become the Lord of Winterfell months ago, a role thrust upon him by the devastating catastrophes that had befallen his family, rather than a natural and welcome inheritance. He shouldered the immense burden of this sudden and difficult transition with a seriousness befitting a young man who had not yet fully processed the whirlwind of his emotions, a storm of grief and responsibility that offered him no respite, no opportunity to pause and find his bearings. The two men who had grown up as brothers within the nurturing walls of the Eyrie, Ned and Robert, now jointly led the rebellion's sprawling military effort. They weren't always stationed in the same location on the war-torn map, and their strategies weren't always as perfectly coordinated as later hindsight might suggest. But they were united in purpose and bound by a deep shared understanding. Their bond of friendship transcended the merely personal. It was the very timber that braced and held the alliance upright. Without it, the fragile political arrangement that held the diverse rebel coalition together would have fractured, leaving few reasons for the alliance to endure. Lords who harbored doubts about Robert's volatile temper found reassurance in Ned's unwavering steadiness and commitment to a just and equitable resolution. Lords who were inspired by Robert's fiery energy but wary of his impulsive judgment knew that Ned's calming presence was always somewhere in the broader strategic picture, acting as a crucial check and balance. Jon Arryn skillfully managed the broader political architecture of the rebellion, navigating the complex web of alliances and allegiances. Hoster Tully effectively secured the Riverlands, preventing the Central Kingdoms from sliding back into the grasp of the crown, and steadily, through months of arduous marching and bitter fighting, through a relentless campaign that tested the men to their physical and emotional limits, and that proved the depth and quality of their commitment, the rebel armies relentlessly pushed toward the decisive moment that would determine the future of the realm. That moment was destined to unfold at the Trident, the site of the river's most accessible fords. But before the climactic clash at the Trident, there was the desperate struggle for control of the Riverlands, its fields and villages serving as unwilling battlegrounds. And before the Trident, there was the long and brutal siege of Storm's End, a place of immense strategic value. The Riverlands, strategically vulnerable due to its geography, had not chosen this war. They rarely did. That was the peculiar and recurring tragedy of the Central Kingdoms. Strung out along the great rivers, exposed on all sides, bordered by nearly every power in the realm, and yet effectively protected by none, the Riverlands served as a constant crossroads of conflict. Whenever armies mobilized in Westeros, they inevitably traversed the Riverlands, trampling its fields and disrupting its fragile economy. When the great houses quarreled, it was the farms and villages along the Trident's fertile banks that bore the brunt of the devastation, paying the heaviest price and enduring the longest suffering. Lord Hoster Tully understood this grim reality better than most. His decision to join the rebellion had not been taken lightly. It was a carefully calculated decision based on the need to remove a despot, but one that was full of consequences. He knew the terrible cost that it would exact on the land and people he governed. That heavy cost quickly materialized. Royalist forces loyal to the crown, desperately striving to hold the strategically vital center of the continent against the surging rebel advance, pressed into the Riverlands from multiple directions. The great river castles, once symbols of regional power and stability, became fiercely contested battlegrounds. their walls stained with blood and their courtyards littered with the debris of war. Supply lines vital to the rebel alliance snaked through territory that royalist forces could effectively threaten, sever, and contest, turning the flow of resources into a dangerous gamble. The Riverlands became, for much of the war's middle phase, the epicenter of the conflict, where the fighting was thickest